Welcome Dr. Isidro Morales Moreno. He's professor and researcher at the Graduate School of Public Policy and Administration at the TEC de Monterrey. He's also contributing expert and scholar at the Baker Institute's Mexico Center. Isidro is based in Mexico City, so thanks for joining us. Also joining us is Graham Campbell. He's the president of the Energy Council of Canada, and he's based in Ottawa.
Okay.
Finally, Erik Milito is based here in DC. He's the director of Upstream and Industry Operations at the American Petroleum Institute. Each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a broader conversation with you all. With that, I'll turn it over to Isidro.
Yeah. Thank you very much to Christian and the CEO, the IDB, for their kind invitation. Thank you very much for being here. I'm not going to repeat about the highlights of Mexico's energy reform. I'm going to highlight the uncertainties and I would say ambiguities of the new policy environment that this reform is going to create or is creating already. To my meaning, and since I'm not working in government, so I have made my own analysis and I've been discussing with other colleagues and practitioners, I see three ambiguities or uncertainties. The first one is the new relationship between government and firms, either private or public firms, in the energy sector and especially in the hydrocarbon sector. The second one is the fiscal regime. As you know, there's a new fiscal constraints for operating the country. And the third one is the evolution of prices. Well, the first one, the relationship between the state and firms, I think is very important. And it's very important because it concerns NAFTA, it concerns national content, those questions that were addressed in the previous panel. And it's important to mention that the new reform, even the constitutional reform and the secondary legislation, accepts in Article 25th and Article 28th of the Constitution that upstream hydrocarbon activities remain strategic, which means, and that's the constitutional word, that this sector will remain under the exclusive control of the states. This is important to highlight, because even though all valuations have been opened to competition and to private participation, the hydrocarbon upstream sector, which means exploration and production, will remain under the control of the states under the strategic category. So, and this reflects a different relationship between the state and firms. For example, in the case of public firms, which is Pemex in this case, only leases will be granted by the state. For private firms, it will be licenses and contracts, either with short production or short utilities. But under the new legislation, even the secondary legislation, there's no way to know under which conditions the government will grant contracts or licenses to private investors. And to give leases only for Pemex and public enterprises will be at the discretion of government. So that's a first area of ambiguity. And to my opinion, to my meaning, this is being done on purpose. Because in such a way, it depends who is in charge of government, who is in charge of energy policies, will be more generous either to private investors, because every contract or every license will be done on an ad hoc basis, or more generous to public enterprises. The way it's going to work as well, you might see it when the secondary legislation, for example, says that in case of that some contracts will provide technological transfer to Pemex, Pemex, the government can mandate 30% of participation of Pemex in those private contracts. So it will be also generous for Pemex. Or the secondary legislation says as well that in the case of cross-border fields, we already have an agreement with the US on cross-border fields, at least 20% of participation must be assured for Pemex. And if you read secondary legislation, you may see as well that the president has the right to reserve some areas as safeguard areas, so, which means that the president can ban exploration and activities in some strategic areas if he considers that this is important for national security reasons, any reasons, or any other reason. So these are some examples how in the realm of upstream activities in the hydrocarbon sector, the field is not even, so there will be a two-tier approach, one for public enterprises, another one for private ones. The second one is fiscality, and if you read the proposal of the income law, the Ley de Ingresos, you may see that the goal of government is to optimize the oil rate. For example, in the case of leases, Pemex will be taxed at least 71% of operational revenues. And there will be other type of taxes coming from Pemex. And I still don't know whether this is going to be the right tax regime for the company, which, as you know, the company has been squeezed in previous administrations due to transfer. At least now the new legislation says that Pemex will have some operational revenues. But you know that in order to estimate your revenues, you must estimate your cost. And in the case of Pemex, you read carefully the legislation, costs in the case of leases are capped. Those caps reflect that Pemex, if Pemex remains on leases, can only exploit cheap oil, which means onshore oil or shallow waters oil, the round zero. But if Pemex wants to move to deep waters or to unconventional resources, Pemex must migrate her leases to contracts, or Pemex must strike contracts with private partnership, which will be in the consecutive rounds. In the case of licenses and contracts, there's also a myriad of taxes as well, of royalties, but which is not, what is not very transparent is the way the Treasury is going to tax corporate income. And corporate income is not being discussed in the law. It will depend on the Treasury. And now they are discussing in the Mexican Congress that perhaps some exemptions of income taxes could be granted to some private companies. So what I want to say is that there is a realm of uncertainties, and the reform won't resolve that. It will be part of the new environment. And last but not least, prices. Hector said that the goal of the reform is to have cheap energy to lower prices. Yes, we can do that. Mexico has done that through subsidies. Will subsidies continue? Well, the government is saying that from 2018, gasoline tax will be erased. But the legislation says nothing about that. And if you read carefully, the subsidies will be the realm of the executive, and they are worked by decree. And the legislation does not ban the executive to derogate subsidies. So subsidies will remain. We have subsidies in all fuels except natural gas. So if prices are not transparent, I think it will be very difficult for some companies to invest, not only in upstream activities, but in the midstream, in infrastructure, because Mexico has a huge problem of transportation and distribution, especially on gas. So if you don't have transparent prices, it will be difficult. So I want to stop here, and those are the three uncertainties I want to highlight. Thank you very much.
Graham, go ahead. Floor is
Thank you
yours.
very much. Graham Campbell, Energy Council of Canada. I just wanted to say a word or two before I start with give you some information on Energy Council. It's a public-private organization headquartered in Canada with national scope in Canada. Our mission is central to all we do, to forge a better understanding of energy issues in order to optimally shape the energy sector for the benefit of all Canadians. What makes us unique is our membership. Over 65 members, many industry companies, almost all of the industry associations, and from a government perspective, the federal government and 6 of our provincial governments. This is an important point for Canada because the provincial governments play the strongest role in Canada in energy development. You can find out more at www.energy.ca. So why should the Continental Agenda be important? And I commend your organization, Christian, for identifying this topic and taking it on and bringing us together. First of all, we share landmass, rivers, lakes, and airsheds, which automatically makes us part of the same continent, part of the same issue. Secondly, many of our geological basins cross boundaries. The Eagle Ford into Mexico, the Williston Basin spans the national border between Canada and the United States. But perhaps the strongest reason is economic. The continent generates 30% of the world's goods and services, not an insignificant fraction. Our trade with Mexico is now about $20 billion plus annually, which is albeit still a small fraction of the $1 billion a day that we trade with the United States. And lastly, I think the reason is most important is that the situation is so fluid and changing so rapidly. We've heard about supply abundance, we've just heard about Mexico's reform. Canada is rich in supply, growing rapidly, and we need export markets. So that's the very best reason for talking to each other, and I think the trilateral agenda is the perfect place. I've identified 4 ways or 4 channels that this dialogue can take place. First of all is nation to nation. Our political leaders, top leadership, met in February in Toluca, and they committed to, quote, opening a new chapter in our partnership, and they recognized energy as a trilateral priority. With this broad direction, the trilateral energy ministers will be meeting later this year. They're going to discuss renewable energy, unconventional energy, energy efficiency, infrastructure, innovation, unconventional energy sources, energy trade, and responsible resource development. I don't know how long the meeting's going to be, but I'm thinking maybe 3 or 4 weeks to cover that agenda. So the point here is sustained leadership from the highest political levels in our governments is essential top-down drive to propel the trilateral agenda forward. Secondly, dialogue between states and provinces. The agenda, of course, is not limited to presidents and the Prime Minister alone. Collaboration is also being led by state governments in the United States and Mexico and the provinces in Canada. An example is the joint sale of emission credits in a carbon market created between California and Quebec. This is an exciting implementation of a climate policy between 2 subnational entities in North America. Many observers have noted that this is a situation where a U.S. state and a Canadian province are well out ahead of their national governments on implementing climate policy. Secondly, Canada has a long experience with oil and gas regulation by both provincial authorities responsible for energy within their boundaries and federal organizations. An example of this is the Alberta Energy Regulator and Mexico's Ministry of Energy through the National Hydrocarbon Commission have signed a Memorandum of Understanding in June 2014. Their press release said the AER and the CNH will work together in order to develop best practice regulations and monitoring methods, particularly in the areas of shale gas development, water management, enhanced oil recovery, and venting and flaring. And you would know that these are very key issues for the petroleum sector. Third opportunity, a third channel, is the business opportunities or the business sector. A central feature of our approach to energy policy in Canada is letting the markets work. In the context of today's conference, this means giving the energy industry the rules, the regulations, the framework to get on with business. The reforms being implemented as we speak in Mexico will result in a more open market for companies to do business in a manner more similar to how they operate in Canada and the United States today. In fact, energy business is already happening. Our Export Development Canada, which is a financing organization for export-oriented companies, estimates that there are 85 Canadian companies presently active in the Mexican oil and gas sector. Secondly, according to a report by Canada West, 3,000 Mexican firms have reported receiving capital investment from Canadian companies. Further, the government of Mexico has permitted private investment in natural gas distribution systems since the mid-90s. There's approximately $2.6 billion invested by one of our major pipeline companies already in the Mexican energy sector. With respect to electricity, where I believe the reforms are even more dramatic than they are in the oil and gas sector, there are significant opportunities as well. This will permit investment in generation and commercialization of electricity, which I believe is retailing electricity in our terminology, and will provide open access to all market participants through the new Independent Electricity System Operator, an institution within electricity systems that's commonplace now in Canada. Also allowed will be contracts with private investors for expansion and modernization of the electricity transportation grid and local distribution infrastructure. Fourth are initiatives led by trilateral organizations. Many organizations outside of government are dedicated to strengthening implementation of trilateral connections between our three countries. Such organizations play a key role outside of government and are a key component in making trilateral collaboration happen. By way of example, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, the CEC, with headquarters in Montreal, Quebec, was created under the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. The mandate of the CEC is to support cooperation among NAFTA partners to address environmental issues of concern to each, including the environmental challenges and opportunities presented by continent-wide free trade. The CEC has recently published reports on green buildings in North America and emissions from power plants. This is but one example of the work that can be done by many, and is being done by many non-governmental organizations on the trilateral agenda. Before closing, let me share one last thought with you. That is, are we contemplating integration in the sense of a fully meshed and centrally controlled energy system for our continent, or are we aiming to find other ways to work better together? When reporting on the February discussion around energy, our three leaders used the terminology common strategies, and the title of the joint statement was Building the Most Competitive and Dynamic Region in the World. So my reading for today's purpose is that for energy considerations at least, this points us in the direction of cooperation, closer collaboration, and finding opportunities and synergies amongst our business community, governments, and NGOs to work more closely together. I'll leave my remarks to this, at this point and look forward to your questions to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Eric?
Thank you. I'd also like to thank the Council of the Americas. This is a great event to put on. You know, we hear a lot in the U.S. about U.S. energy independence, but the real way to look at it is North American energy security and working together as a North American energy system, because truly we are neighbors and we are sharing borders and we're sharing reservoirs and we're sharing expertise and universities and exchanging the information that we need to. And I believe that Ramon, David, and Hector really laid out a lot of these issues. But if you look at where we've come from, if you look back to 2009, I think the amount of oil that we were producing in North America was around 10, 11 million barrels a day. Global consumption around 85, 88 million barrels a day. So we were, as a North American continent, we were producing probably around 12, 13% of the oil that was being demanded globally. If you look 10 years from now, North American energy production is probably going to be around 20 million barrels a day and global demand around 100 million barrels a day. So we're going from supplying 10 to 12% of the world's oil to maybe 20%, and that's huge. And we need to make sure we talk about integration, but also one thing we're not talking a lot about, but which Israel alluded to, is national security. And the reason why I say that is because as a North American continent, we can improve global geopolitical security. Excuse me, got a little frog there. And what's in the news today? Russia. Russia gets 50% of its government revenues from energy production. 70% of its exports are from hydrocarbon exports. We can have an influence over what happens geopolitically by putting these supplies into the global market. Central and Eastern European nations are coming to the U.S. begging for our natural gas. Canada has huge natural gas fields off Nova Scotia. Mexico is moving forward with potentially developing these vast reservoirs in places like the Gulf of Mexico where we know there's a lot of natural gas. These are opportunities to shore up our supplies domestically, but also to play a geopolitical role internationally so that these diverse supplies and these stable supplies coming from North America provide more stability to the globe. So it's just huge. And if you look at where we're going as a world and as a North American continent, our consumption of oil, natural gas, coal is going to decline a little bit. Oil and natural gas will probably stay pretty steady. Renewables are going to go up dramatically, and I'm looking really at the DOE's EIA numbers. And our overall energy demand in the U.S. is probably going to go up about 10%, and that's probably similar to what we'll see all over North America. But globally, energy demand is going to go up 50%. So we have a huge opportunity as a North American continent to not import as much and have our money going out of the North American continent, but to have people coming to us and investing in Canada, U.S., and Mexican energy systems. And the opportunities present themselves in many ways. Free trade and policies where we're ensuring free trade through the development of common infrastructure is an area we need to ensure that we have those opportunities. I think we talk the talk that we're big on free trade, but I'm not sure that we're walking the walk. We've slow-walked LNG export approvals. Canada's moving forward with it. Other areas around the world are moving forward with it. And we have opportunities where if Mexico is developing its natural gas supplies and it makes sense from a marketing standpoint to even export some of those from a place like the Gulf of Mexico, we could join up and use terminals in the Gulf of Mexico in places like Louisiana and Texas. There's ways where we can work together. Also on the crude oil side, we have this ban in place. Fortunately, we have an exception for Canada. So we are now exporting more crude oil than we have ever before, 260 to 270,000 barrels a day. It's all going to Canada, so that's great. But we have additional opportunities in these areas so that as a North American continent, we are providing these hydrocarbon resources, which are in great demand outside the U.S. to other parts of the world that really see us as a stable trading partner. So trade's a big issue. Job creation, I think right now, the Canadian oil sands support about 50, 60, 70,000 jobs in the U.S. That could rise to 600,000 jobs by 2035. So what's happening in Canada supports jobs here. And as we would see the Mexican energy economy grow through privatization and through its energy reforms, you can see this exchange occurring across the North American continent. What's happening in a producing state like Texas ripples across the U.S. economy. What happens in Canada, we've seen ripple across the Canadian economy and the U.S. economy, and we can see that happening across all borders. Technology transfer is huge. We heard about the Eagle Ford shale. Excuse me. Eagle Ford, just a few years ago, was producing 50 to 100,000 barrels a day. It's more than 1 million barrels a day, and it runs into Texas. Now, U.S. has a lot of things working in its favor when it comes to being able to increase its energy production by 3 million barrels a day in the past 5 years. But we have to make sure that Mexico's moving forward in a direction where it doesn't have just 10 rigs operating in Eagle Ford. We have 1,800 rigs operating, which is what you need to do to be an energy superpower. But there's an opportunity there. The Eagle Ford is plentiful. I mean, you can get natural gas from that, as well as the huge quantities of crude oil. And then technology transfer when it comes to deep water. The good thing is we've joined up with Mexico, and we've, in the U.S., finally, last year, passed the transboundary agreement. So that's in effect. So we can have these transboundary areas that ride the U.S.-Mexico border in the Gulf of Mexico. We can develop those. And with this new reform, we're going to be able to transfer technologies. Industry standards is an important area. We're working with the Hydrocarbon Commission as API. Our organization started out in 1919 as a standards developing organization. Well, so what? Well, the big thing there is that we're developing highly technical standards so that the industry has a foundation to operate from globally. The greatest demand for industry standards is actually outside the U.S. China is the biggest purchaser of our documents, and we have quality programs to make sure that you're drilling a well or creating a piece of drill pipe or a blowout preventer, whatever it might be, and it meets spec. So you get certified as a company. And these types of fundamental industry technical programs are important because a lot of times regulators can't keep up. The industry is always a step ahead. So in the US and other countries, we've seen the regulators require the industry to follow these types of standards. And as I said, it could be on a piece of equipment, how you design a piece of drill pipe, how you develop and manufacture a blowout preventer. It could be on measuring. Measuring is huge when you're looking at how much natural gas is coming through production and through pipelines or oil. And you want to have good measurement standards in place so the government gets its money at the end of the day, and they can validate it through having these. And what we're doing now is working with CNH in Mexico on an MOU so that they have the industry standards and they can use our standards as they move forward to regulate in Mexico. So that area of ensuring safe and environmentally responsible operations is huge, and I think all of our countries have the ability to share information there. One last thing I'd like to talk about is, we have the oil sands that are being developed, huge, vast resource, and a lot of the technologies are being applied to that could apply to a different type of geology. It's called oil shale. The stuff that's coming from the tight formations in the Bakken and in Eagle Ford and in Colorado and in the Permian Basin of Texas, that's shale oil, and it's crude oil just tightly found in the rock. It's very impermeable, low porosity. You need to break it open with hydraulic fracturing, which is a major technology advancement that's allowed us to become an energy superpower. The oil sands is bitumen, which we heard it referred to by David as kind of like a peanut butter substance. But we have this oil shale, which is kerogen. And it's similar, but the estimates are that there's 800 billion barrels of it. Now, it's not something we'd be producing anytime soon because it's still in commercial phase and research and development, but the techniques that are being learned and applied and the evolution of technology in Canada is educating the industry on how to potentially do that in places like Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, where we know that resource could be. And the reason why I point that out is because as technology develops, the industry and the North American industry can continue to create possibilities where we didn't think there were any. 5 years ago, we didn't think we'd be creating and developing this much energy from shale rock and tight formations when it comes to natural gas and oil production. In 10 years from now, who knows? But we could maybe get past 20 million barrels a day and exceed that and become, the energy power as a continent, kind of feeding the world and having the world relying upon us. We all rely on Canada greatly for energy, and they're a great example because they are supplying Canada and the world, and we as a continent could probably move in that direction as well. So thank you for the opportunity, and turn it over.
Great, thank you for these opening remarks. Very interesting, covering a lot of different areas. I guess my first question would be to Isidro. What does shale development, unconventional development, mean for Mexico and for North America? And do you see, within the context and the framework of the reforms, the incentives and the type of conditions that are in place in order to duplicate or some way approximate what's going on in the United States?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, we have a problem in Mexico for developing shale gas or even conventional gas prices. I mean, we all know that North American price or the Henry Hub price is the lowest in the world. It's still below $4 per million of British units. So in Mexico, we have already, Pemex already explored or developed 3 wells of shale gas, and if you, this is available information, and the cost of drilling in Mexico by Pemex is twice or 3 times more than the Eagle Ford formation. So we're not competitive under that present circumstances. I talked about round zero. I talked that costs are capped for leases, and if you see the cap for natural gas is $2.5 per 1,000 cubic meter, which is going to be very low, I mean, in order to deduct costs if you want to develop shale gas. So, I mean, Pemex will be interested in developing conventional associated gas or conventional gas in Burgos or in shallow waters as well, but not shale gas. If Pemex wants to develop shale gas, it must either join another company for a contract, private contract, which the fiscal regime is different, or the government must strike a bidding process for attracting investors, those investors that are already working in the Eagle Ford Basin to Mexico. But prices currently work against that. So if I want to construct a scenario in terms of cooperation, I would say that for Mexico in the near future, the following 5, perhaps even 7 years, it's better to import gas from the US because it's cheaper. What we have to invest now, and what we have to do in order to attract investments is in infrastructure, because another point is that we are importing gas, LNG gas, from the Middle East and not from the US. Why? There's a surplus in the US because we don't have the infrastructure in order to import gas by pipeline. So we have bottlenecks in the midstream level. So in the following 5 to 7 years, Mexico must create the conditions in order to enhance infrastructure for developing a domestic gas market and to rely on imports. And after 7 years, its prices get better, it will be interesting for Mexico to develop shale gas.
Okay, Graham, do you have anything to add? Or Mark?
I think it's been mentioned by my colleague, but the access to the technology for shale gas production is something that Mexico would be very much interested in. The costs would come down dramatically, the techniques would be refined. There's a learning curve that applies to all technologies as applied to particular basins. Not all basins are the same, even though they geologists draw maps around them and make big circles. But there's a learning curve that we've experienced in our country, the US has as well in the basins there, that I think would be of great use to Mexico. And we're pleased to be involved already with you. And I think there's that technological sharing, there's the lowering of costs, there's the refinement of techniques to match local basins, all of which could help Mexico increase its natural gas production. Hopefully remove some of the LNG imports that must be costing you 3 or 4 times price per cubic foot.
Great. Well, I'm going to open it up to the audience. If you have a question, please state your name and affiliation. And please wait for the microphone, which is coming around.
David Mares. Yeah? David Mares, University of California, San Diego, and Baker Institute, Rice. Question for Isidro. Given the overselling of the benefits in the short term in Mexico, the benefits of the reform, and given all that you've told us about the discretion that is there for the President and Senate in implementing the actual reform in the next presidential election, which is not that far off, all right? It's quite likely that the PRD, which barely lost the last 2 presidential elections, could in fact win the next one based to a good degree on the disappointment in the fact that, in fact, electricity prices to the consumer didn't go down. They actually went up as prices were freed, if they're freed. That in fact the recovery of production is nowhere near what Peña Nieto said it would be. So if we assume that the PRD wins the next election, is there anything in the legislation that locks in the reform, or is the discretion sufficient there that a PRD president could actually undo a great deal of the reform?
Okay.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. Thank you very much, Dave, for the question. If, let's say, if the PRD wins the following election, which is possible, I mean, not now, but it could be, depends how the impact of reform will evolve. You must change the constitution in order to revert the reform, because there was a constitutional change. That's also very important. So you need that 2/3 of the Congress in each chamber and the 2/3 of the majority of local Congress in order to change the constitution, which for me will be quite impossible. Because if the PRD wins, it will be a minority, as we have now a minority, in coalition with other parties, which I still don't think, perhaps part of the PRI will support the PRD. So I think that the core of the reform is irreversible. What it could change is the interpretation of secondary reform. That's why I said that there's a lot of ambiguity. But that ambiguity is on purpose, because it's a political pact, not with the PRD, because as we know, the PRD didn't vote the reform, but with the, how can I call it, the center left of the PRI, which they strongly oppose also that complete opening of all chains. And that's why, that's the only way to explain why the upstream operations remain strategic. If you read the original version that Mr. Peña Nieto submitted to Congress, the PRI wanted to open all the value chains, even at the upstream level. It was during the discussion, and some people said that even from the PAN, they said, no, we have to put a lock-in in the upstream operations, and they have to remain under the control of the state. And this explains, and I'm taking the opportunity to answer Mrs. Negroponte's question, this explains why the 35% of national content is possible, because if you make a legislative reading or a constitutional reading, upstream operations won't be part of NAFTA. They are still exempted from NAFTA. Why? Because Chapter 6 of NAFTA says clearly, go to the agreement, that in case of how to say that, in case that there's a misinterpretation under NAFTA and the Constitution prevails on NAFTA. It's clear. Go to the Chapter 6 of NAFTA says, in case of there's a contradiction between the NAFTA chapter and the Constitution prevails. And the Constitution says that upstream operations will remain strategic, so it remains aloof NAFTA, and that's why Mexico doesn't have to renegotiate NAFTA, because the rest is open. So, so if we have a different political scenario in the next 4 years, perhaps we will have center-left government led by the PRD in coalition with the PRI and some other small parties. And they won't change the constitution because they won't have the political capital, but they will interpret the secondary legislation biased to Pemex and public enterprises, because the legislation allows for the creation of new public enterprises. So they can create a new enterprise, public enterprise for shale gas, which has been discussed by the PRI previous to this reform.
All right, we'll take, we're running out of time here. We'll take a couple questions at once. Diana? Do you mind, just, we're recording this.
I can repeat it.
Diana Negroponte, a question for Erik and a question also for Isidro. For Erik, what is your experience API working with Pemex over the last, let's say, decade. And for Isidro Morales, given the absence of local governments in Tamaulipas, what are the prospects for the infrastructure and the governance to support the shale industry in the Burgos Basin?
One more question right here.
Hi. Sophia Norton, McLarty Associates. And as you mentioned, there's a huge need for midstream infrastructure. Do you think, and there needs to be the conditions created to encourage investment in that. What are those conditions specifically, and do you think the reforms in secondary legislation will address that?
Okay, quickly.
We'll take one more than that, and we'll cut it off right there.
I have to write these
Hi.
down.
Heather
Somebody writing
Connell.
these down? I don't have much of a memory.
Heather Connell from Ascendant Program Services, and this is actually related to the previous questions. Could you provide some examples of specific infrastructure projects that you could see, that you guys see as necessary for Mexico to develop the industry?
All right, let's try and keep it very brief.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of API's involvement with Pemex, there really hasn't been a lot. But our individual companies, we are an organization that represents more than 600 member companies. And those companies, particularly on the service side, companies like Halliburton, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, the companies who actually get out there and engage in a lot of the operational aspects, my understanding is they are now working to try to be part of this reform movement where more companies can come in. And then as the reform occurs, you'll probably see more of that. But so that those relationships have primarily been with the member companies. But I think we have an opportunity here when it comes to really providing standards and the ability to do things right by having that better relationship with CNH as well as Pemex as we move forward. I think a lot of the other questions go to Graham and Israel.
Graham, do you want to react?
Not to the Pemex question,
Right.
I won't that. In terms of infrastructure projects, I'll make the point that I made earlier with respect to the exploring and shale gas basins. There's already a good deal of work going on, and I think we're building incrementally, and we're finding ways to involve more parties, more players, more companies to assist Mexico in building its infrastructure. The major issue for Canada, from the infrastructure standpoint, and this really wasn't the question of the nature of the question, but as David said earlier, it's access, infrastructure to access markets outside of our traditional main market in the United States because of the shale gas revolution, shale oil revolution, which displaced a good deal of Canadian supply. So we're looking at Keystone XL, of course, but there's also other implications. It's an important point, an important question, because the energy infrastructure dimension of all this is sometimes overlooked.
Yeah, well, I have two questions. One is on security, the other one is on infrastructure. Mrs. Negroponte, you're right. Unfortunately, shale resources are located in a very unsafe place, which is northern Mexico and in Tamaulipas and Nuevo León. This is completely. This is what we call it an externality, but we have to put a price on that. And in the discussion now, also for the reform, they have a chapter on security, and the Congress wants to, engage governments and local governments to increase the security level in oil operations, because we have a new legislation on industrial security, on environmental security, but we don't have legislation concerning safety on the ground. So that's an externality. It will remain, and it will be a negative externality for the development of shale gas, definitely. It's a cost. And in terms of infrastructure, let me tell you that NAFTA opened investment in infrastructure in gas lines. And Mexico only increased its gas grid in 1% in 20 years from private investors. So it was completely unsuccessful. Why? Because we have a monopoly, but we also have a monopsony in terms of consumption. 85% of natural gas consumption is being done by two companies, Pemex and CFE, the monopoly on electricity. So if you have a monopoly, you don't have competitive prices, and you have to construct the gas line according to the priorities of CFE or Pemex. So as long as we don't have a market, it will be very difficult for investors to engage in the midstream operations. Currently, Pemex is constructing a new gas line, the Ramones gas line, in order to supply the Northwest, because Northwest, there's no lines at all in Mexico, and we have industrial centers there, from Guadalajara to Tijuana. There's no pipeline, there's no gas line. The way we supply those regions are by tanks, which are completely unsafe and very costly. So that's a challenge, but in order to overcome that challenge, it's not only the reform, it's only to make, to construct an environment that's attractive, safe, but to have transparent prices. So it's a huge challenge. I don't think that we will have fast outcomes in the near future. I think that the only thing that we have that is feasible, and that's for economic and political reasons in the next 4 or 5 years, is to increase our oil output from 2.5 million to 3. That's the government's goal. Why? Because we need more revenues. That's the only feasible thing we can do. Apart that, everything is uncertain.
If I can add one thing real quickly, the shale revolution is in its infancy. We're only 5 years into it, and what we're seeing is the supply on natural gas has shot up so dramatically that we're demand restrained. So if Mexico is able to go through with this type of reform and creates a competitive environment, then you will see hopefully the market react to that, because then we wouldn't have as many wells shut in, would have another market to be able to take our gas to, and would be able to alleviate some of these issues with having to bring in LNG from Israel and the Middle East or wherever else it's coming from, and therefore bring lower cost natural gas in from the United States, and then bring ultimately lower electricity to the Mexican populace. So this is really a growth opportunity in many respects, and we're so early on, but we're also hitting a ceiling in how much we can actually produce, because our market's limited to really North America at this point, because we're not at this point in a position to really send anything overseas by LNG. And as a market, we send stuff back and forth to Canada, Mexico, both ways, but there's a huge opportunity there. And right now, we'd be looking to sell gas to anybody that's willing to take it, but those types of reforms sound like they're needed before we can get that infrastructure in place, because we're getting past these necessary steps.
Well, thanks. This has been a very interesting discussion. I'm sure we could go on for quite a while. Please join me in thanking our panelists.